Hello, and thank you for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Barry Jackson. I'm a professor and vice president of U.S.A. Institute of Osteopathy, and professor and director of the Drug Alcohol Wellness Network at Bloomsburg University, Pennsylvania. My presentation will discuss the inequity of educational opportunity during a pandemic. I want to thank you for joining me today. The current pandemic crisis has forced major changes on society all around the globe in an effort to control the disease. Only in retrospect will we know if these actions were successful. In my talk today, I will focus on the impact of school closures. Classrooms in schools and universities in most nations were closed in an effort to protect children from the spread of the deadly disease. Educators turned to the use of electronic media and communication sites to provide instruction. At first glance, this appears to be an excellent solution. UNESCO's goal of free universal education would be helpful. It stressed the development of open educational resources and open educational practices to help disseminate information through modern communications means, basically to use the internet to spread education. The objectives of UNESCO's distant learning were to give greater access to disadvantaged people, providing equal educational opportunities in an effort to achieve social justice and reduce poverty around the world. This would make the economic advantages of wealthier nations and individuals available to less wealthy people. Free universal education online is a theoretically excellent idea. To be achieved, however, one must have not only educational resources, but they must be readily available. Standard practices also needed to be available, but availability is not necessarily accessibility. Although the focus was to be on primary education, much of the resources went to university and professional education. This mistaken focus resulted in a failure to provide primary education. Laryard's research found that university-educated people used the resources most often to further their professional development. Online education did not give education to the disadvantaged, rather to those who already had advantages. Technological advances did not assist. Universal free education was based on two incorrect assumptions. Providing resources and standard practices equaled opportunity. The availability of these resources did not mean they were accessible. Theoretically, the internet was everywhere, but without electricity, Wi-Fi, computing equipment, there is no access. So research showed that education does work, but it depends more on access than on resources and standard practices. As early as 2003, Norris predicted the failure of free universal education due to the learning problems of access. The financially disadvantaged for whom this was designed did not have the means to access the materials online, and therefore availability without access is not equity. The project failed, as predicted by Norris. There were many access limitations, increased potential digital interaction, but no coordination. Multiple platforms were provided. If you have multiple platforms and each requires their own technological criteria, then you cannot necessarily access everything from one platform. Skype, WhatsApp, MIT, Google Search, Google Classroom, Google Meet, all of these are wonderful platforms, but they don't necessarily interface. Another problem was Wi-Fi hotspots. During the quarantine, many of these were closed, and therefore people who relied on smartphones to access information found that they couldn't access it. Home resources were also stressed. When two or more children are at home, or parents are working from home and only have one device to access the internet, we find that there's enormous amount of stress. When the quarantine closed schools and universities, libraries were also closed, along with the residence halls. So again, Wi-Fi spaces normally available to university students were no longer available. Places like Starbucks and Paul's, popular with students, were also closed. Many students depended on these Wi-Fi hotspots, because they couldn't afford internet in their own apartments. All of these things made university education more difficult, and the home resources were stressed as well. Parents spending additional hours helping children download digital platforms, homework, and helping them complete their homework. All of these things made it more difficult for people to be at home and work through their equipment. Many times, households didn't have the basic equipment needed for online study. They didn't have multiple computers or laptops, or maybe they didn't have a smartphone. Audio and video equipment and printers and download capabilities were also missing in many cases. And when they were present, many parents simply lack the technical skills to help their children. So university education was interrupted in multiple places around the world. I want to give you an example of a university in the United States in which there was considerable disruption. I spoke with a university professor in the United States who teaches developmental English writing. And what she reported was kind of interesting. 100% of her students had a smartphone available. Interestingly enough, these mobile phones or smartphones were available to all the students, but only 28% of these students were able to access the internet during the university closure. The reason for this was, again, university libraries were closed, hotspots in residence halls were closed, and the normal pizza joints and coffee houses that they would go to that had free Wi-Fi were all closed during the pandemic quarantine. Many of the students who were unable to access the internet were among the poorest students in her classroom whose native language was not English. They depended on the university's library computers and these residence hall Wi-Fi connections, or the local establishments that had free Wi-Fi. Without these hotspots, they were unable to complete their reading assignments or writing assignments, and they couldn't interface directly with the university professor. Another example exists in Paris, where a special needs primary classroom had 18 disadvantaged students in the classroom, but only 2 had internet access, apart from the classroom itself. Romanian schools and universities have similar problems, and I want to discuss those in a bit more detail. The recent IRIS report on Romania, issued on the 8th of May of this year, indicated that 903,870 children in Romania who were enrolled in school had no internet access. This equals 32% of all school-age children in Romania. In addition, it found that 50% of these students were not involved in online education. 50% of 900,000 did not participate in online education during this quarantine and school closure. Not surprisingly, it was rural children who had the greatest difficulty accessing the internet, with 38% of those children having no internet access. Urban children lacked access in 24% of the cases. Access was limited by a number of factors. Among the most common was related to the number of children enrolled for school. With 2 or more children at home, all trying to do classes at the same time on the internet, conflicts arose. 2 or more children could be scheduled for a class at the same time. One might have an assignment which required the computer, while the other needed to be online for instruction at the same time. This is also made more difficult because parents many times had to work at home, and they too needed the internet. 1/3 of all households did not have microphones for use with a computer, and 25% did not have video equipment for their computer. Both seem to be essential for online lessons. The ability to scan information and print homework and reports also is essential, but was missing in an unknown percentage of the population. But for those who relied on smartphones, they did not have these capabilities. Online lessons, therefore, resulted in fewer contacts with the teacher than normally. 2/3 of the students had daily lessons, while less than a quarter of them had lessons about twice a week. Scheduling conflicts, as I've mentioned, with parents also created issues that we needed to address or needed to be addressed by parents. Time and study. Well, a good thing, I guess, is that parents spent more time with their children on their lessons. 70% reported that they spent more time with children now during this quarantine than they had previous to the quarantine. However, student time on lessons increased dramatically. In addition to internet class time, which could be several hours in a day, 25% of the students and parents reported that they spent 4 hours or more in addition to these classroom hours doing their homework, downloading materials, printing it out, and returning it to the faculty, to the student faculty. 26% spent 3 hours or more. 31% spent 2 hours. And during this time, contact with teachers decreased by 38%. Can educational equity be achieved in Romania? Well, there are several barriers to this goal, and they need to be looked at in some detail. First of all, 52,000 homes in Romania have no electricity at all. 93% of these homes were found to be in the Român communities. So these disadvantaged peoples were disadvantaged further because they could not access education online. They had no resources to do this. And a proposal in Bucharest and elsewhere to provide cell phones to those who did not have them is inadequate. If you consider that a cell phone requires electricity and being recharged, and people do not have electricity, how do you recharge the phone? Secondly, who pays for this phone? Okay, the phones were given free, but somebody's going to have to pay for the subscription. Somebody's going to have to pay for maintenance and upkeep. Somebody has to download the applications to be used. And remember, there are multiple platforms being used by multiple teachers. These are a problem we need to address in the future. Standard internet platforms need to be created in which all faculty and schools use the same platform. So at what cost to these nearly 904,000 children if they were all received a smartphone? What cost would it be to the society? How much can you really afford? So there are some issues here that need to be addressed. What happens when the economy reopens, when parents return to work? Will they have supervision? Will the children be supervised? Will they be assisted in their online activity for school? These are issues that need to be addressed. And they need to be addressed pretty quickly. There will be another crisis. We know this. It happens all the time. What will be the next crisis that closes schools? That we don't know. There may be an earthquake, a major weather event, flood, another pandemic perhaps, the return of this pandemic. Will we be better prepared to educate our children in such situations? UNESCO's experiment with OER and OEP failed, not because of availability of wonderful resources, but because accessibility to these resources. We've known this since Norris's work way back in 2003. Those experts reported that the failure of UNESCO was inevitable based on the inability of most peoples to access the materials. We need to plan now to face the reality of that failure and to move forward with new plans. Will we be prepared? Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate your tuning in. Goodbye.